Welcome to the sixth edition of the Halifax Black Film Festival, founded by the Fabian Collis Foundation, co-presented by TD in collaboration with Global News, available online from February 24th to 27th, 2022. Be sure to get your all-access pass on halifaxblackfilm.com. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amber Friday, and I am a video journalist with Global News Halifax. And before we begin, I would like to do a Halifax land acknowledgement. We wish to begin today's session by acknowledging that we are in Migma. We live, work, and play on ancestral land that belongs to the Migma people, the first peoples of Nova Scotia. As we seek to build a more inclusive municipality, we remember that we are all treaty people and that those of us who are non-Indigenous each have an individual responsibility to acknowledge and address the centuries of injustice, suffering, and broken promises that resulted from European settlement. My name is Amber Friday. I'll be moderating the panel discussion tonight, focused on representation in the media. So like I said, I'm currently a video journalist with Global News. I have worked before with Sportsnet doing an internship, and I also worked briefly with the CBC before I started with Global. And I'm thrilled tonight to announce the panelists. So first up, we have Brian Daly, who is an assistant professor of journalism at the University of King's College in Halifax. He began teaching after working as a reporter, news editor, and producer at 3 television networks and the Canadian Press. Brian has provided leadership consulting services to several media companies and nonprofit corporations. He also runs journalism camps for high school students through the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. Thank you so much for being here, Brian.
Glad to be here.
And next, I'd like to introduce you to Trina Roche. Trina is a proud member of the Glooscap First Nation and an award-winning Migma video journalist. She brings over 2 decades of experience covering Indigenous stories for APTN and CBC to her role as the Rogers Chair in Journalism at the University of King's College. Welcome, Trina. So nice to meet you and happy to have you here with us.
Thank you. I was muted.
Next, we have Dorico Simons, who is employed with the province of Nova Scotia as a senior executive advisor to the deputy minister with the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism Initiatives. Dorico is a founding member of 2 nonprofit organizations, ACE, Arts, Culture, Community, and Economics, a Black-operated nonprofit organization in Halifax, and Game Changers 902, another Black-operated nonprofit organization and social justice advocacy group. With an extensive career in community work in our racialized and most marginalized communities, Dorico has a wealth of community engagement experience. Dorico provides counseling to marginalized youth and is called upon during issues of gun violence in the Black community. Dorico, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
And next up, we have Matthew Byard, who is a local journalism initiative reporter with the Halifax Examiner. He's a graduate of the radio television journalism program at NSCC. He completed an internship with Global News Halifax and attended a private media college and also attended Dalhousie University, where he studied philosophy and political science. Matthew and I were actually classmates at NSCC, and he's a good friend of mine. So happy to have you here with us tonight, Matt.
Thank you for having me. Likewise.
And last but certainly not least, Jarvis Gugu was raised in Wigoma, Unamagi, and attended an Indian day school and graduated from a Migma Inamanwaje.
Close enough. Migma, get on, boy.
Okay. He holds degrees from St. Mary's University, Dalhousie Law School, and is a non-practicing member of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society. He has presented many times on Migma history and culture. Jarvis, thank you so much for being here.
Well,
all right, so let's dive right in here. I know we only have an hour and we have a lot of base to cover, so it doesn't really seem long enough. But Trina, I just want you to get us started. Can you explain why you think representation in the media is so important?
In my role now, because I was doing journalism and still am, but doing it for so long, but now in my role as the Rogers Chair in journalism, my mandate really is to encourage Migma students to consider journalism. And I've had this thought over like the 2 decades that I worked for like APTN, CBC, but mostly APTN, is that there weren't a lot of Migma journalists or Migma students picking journalism as an option. And I always wondered why, but sort of when you're chasing deadlines all the time and just doing your job, you just keep doing that. But now that I'm in my role as an instructor, as teaching journalism, like I really want to get Migma students like thinking about telling their own stories. And I'm always kind of, I want to know what the barriers are, so I'm trying to assess that. I think when you see yourself represented, you're more interested and more keen, and you see it as an option. But it kind of then becomes a chicken and an egg, right? If you don't see yourself represented, then how do you get there? So I think I'm sort of trying to navigate that right now. But it's so important for like for Indigenous storytellers to tell their own stories. And it's important for the people in our stories, because I just did a story on a Migma residential school survivor, and it was a very sort of sensitive story with someone who lived through trauma, and it was important for her to have a Migma journalist, or there was another First Nations producer who was on the story. So it was important for her because she had a sense of trust. So these are our stories. We know the context. We know the way the stories need to be told and the voices that need to be heard. So it's really important we're there. But I'm struggling right now with how we encourage representation if people don't see it. So it's kind of that quandary. If anyone has any solutions, I'm going to take notes.
Yeah, does anyone else want to weigh in here on that?
I do have some thoughts on the representation side. First of all, it's critical that we see all of Canada represented in the newsrooms. And when we talk about news media, if we're talking about other areas of media, sports, entertainment, even if we're talking about fiction, all of this is important because people from our communities bring fresh ideas, fresh perspectives. In the news media, they're in trouble. They're not going to make it if they don't change their business practices, their hiring and promotion practices. They're getting their butts kicked. Traditional media are getting their butts kicked. They haven't adapted to the digital age. They're bleeding staff. They are bleeding people, good people who can find work in other areas that pay better, that have better work environments. And so there are all sorts of structural and institutional issues in news media that are, in my view, partly due to nepotism and hiring way too much from within and not from without, newsrooms that are out of touch. And so you've got to look. I mean, they really have no choice. If they don't adapt, they'll die. So certain organizations, Canadian Association of Black Journalists, are only one of them, are trying to stir these folks up and make them see how urgent the situation is. It's not enough just to hire, by the way. You got to retain. So there are leadership challenges in media. They don't necessarily promote the most inclusive and avant-garde work environments. And so now they're just going to have to compete with everyone else. They're going to have to compete with communications and quit calling them the dark side and quit, because the problem is you use this terminology to essentially say that you're better than everybody else. You're better than communications. You're better than, all the other departments. Sports, for example, you say you're better than them. Well, there are people in your own newsrooms who don't agree with you, and they get enticed to go over to sports. They get enticed to go to communications. So it's just such a closed-minded attitude that's only going to hurt news media if they don't change.
Mm-hmm. And now you have started an initiative called J School Noir, which is a virtual media training and mentorship program geared primarily toward Black Canadian youth. So what made you want to start this program, and why is it important, kind of going off what you were just saying?
Well, it's the brainchild of Nadia Stewart, who's the executive director of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. And when I got brought on in 2018, she gave me the task of making this as a curriculum that she had designed with experts in education. Now we needed to see whether this could work as a recruiting tool to get Black youth even to be interested in media, also to teach them the skills that would be necessary for them to apply to and eventually be accepted to journalism schools. We have a success story. We have a young woman from our first J School Noir event, which was held in Halifax in 2020 in person, weeks before the lockdowns began. This, at the time, she was a grade 11 student. She attended J School Noir. She decided she wanted to become a journalist. She had been on a path towards being a lawyer. She said, nope, I don't want to go to law school. I want to go to journalism school. And actually, she got accepted at King's a couple of months ago. It's great news because it shows that if you have targeted programs focused on the communities themselves, stimulating and sparking the talent that's in those communities, that can bring tangible results. Some of these other big picture things that we're going to talk about, that we have talked about, they may not change. Racism may not go away, okay? But if communities, people who are in a position to help, some of us who've been around and, have some experience, and now it's time for us to start giving back, we should do that. And so that can be part of the solution. It can be a solution within the community itself.
Now, just talking about newsrooms specifically, do you think that there should be a prerequisite in place to ensure diversity in the newsroom?
Complicated, controversial. I've gone back and forth. If we're talking about employment equity, I'm at the point now where I'm in favor of it, just simply because I can speak for the Black community. Some of us aren't getting the jobs. I guess some folks in leadership and media don't think Black people are good enough, don't think we deserve the jobs. Begging, cajoling, and all the rest of it doesn't seem to work. So look, on the question of employment equity, I'm at this point pro. Employment equity is not the perfect solution, but I know some specific examples of people who were qualified, in some cases overqualified, to get jobs in news media. They weren't getting them. A program is brought in which it's targeted hiring, and a qualified person comes into a newsroom. That can only help.
Dorico, tell me about your childhood and the consumption of media. Growing up as a young Black man, were there people in TV, film, news, or other media that felt represented you, and how did that shape you or your ideas of what it meant to be Black?
Well, I would say that certainly growing up, my consumption within my consumption of media, I didn't see myself represented in the main, and I say the mainstream. And that forced me to look a little bit deeper, and so not seeing yourself within the media, because I think that so here's where I'll start, is that I think that there's the media sort of mainstream has a notion of what's important. And I say that in big quotations because there's a lot of folks, of course, within Black community and other communities, that things that are important to our communities don't make it to mainstream, but there's this notion of it's important if it makes it into the media. And so not seeing myself in movies, not seeing myself accurately represented in media, not seeing myself in reporters, not seeing myself in any of that, certainly not seeing yourself shapes you psychologically in some ways if you don't know where to look, if you don't know where to find yourself. And so I don't want to say it had a major negative effect, but it had an effect that just meant that I had to find myself in other things. And, I think that people have a hard time understanding why a movie such as Black Panther was so impactful, because every character in the movie was Black. And to think about that's never happened before. It's almost ridiculous that has never ever happened.
And that just came out in 2018. Like it just seems unfathomable, really.
Yeah, and I would just say, I would finish off that I know that psychologically it certainly does have an effect on young Black folks, male or female or other. And psychologically, not seeing yourself represented within what you're seeing on TV, within your everyday life, can have you thinking that you're not important to society, or you shouldn't be in these particular positions. And, you know, it forced me to take the stance of, well, who am I not to be? And then had to find myself in other materials.
Mhm. What about you, Jarvis? How did you see Indigenous people portrayed in similar media? Do you feel like you were represented? Like, was the vastness and diversity of Indigenous cultures represented, or was it more driven towards stereotypes?
I would say probably maybe a split of both, but maybe towards more on stereotypes. I remember an example I had to go back to is late 1999 after the Marshall decision came out. And one example I share with people is in the school I went to, our teacher, who was a residential school survivor herself, she took the Chronicle Herald, I think that was the paper, and about a week or so after the Marshall decision came out, she cut out letters to the editor and posted up on our wall for in our data studies class. And you can imagine what it was at the time back in the late 1990s. In 1999 was the big fear of fishers were that the Migma were going to deplete the ocean. We're going to kill off everything. And, you know, woe is me. We've been doing this in our family for decades. You know, we get too much and all that. And I did not see counterpoints. And I don't know if it's either the Herald just didn't publish those counterpoint letters or if people just didn't write. Like, did we as Mi'kmaq people feel like they hate us so much? Why should I bother trying to educate them? This was like way before online trolling even took place. This would have been like 1999. Now, I wanted to say you jump forward 20-ish years, you know, 2020, and we saw what happened in southwestern Nova Scotia with Mi'kmaq fishers being attacked. And to me, I see quite the contrast where I recall, remember, you may see in the news, in downtown Halifax, there were movements of solidarity of support from a massive number of non-Mi'kmaq people who came out, who voiced support for Mi'kmaq fishers. And I remember telling people, I told my wife, who's white, I never would have saw this 20 years ago. 20 years ago, my uncle received death threats because he fished out there. And like 20 years later, I want to say it seems like there's like a bit of a reverse where I want to say there seems to be more support for it. But at the same time, I'm also asking myself, did that extra support also come out in fall 2020 because of another wave of support for Black Lives Matter? They came out in summer 2020 after the murder of George Floyd happened, and we saw more anti-racism activism. And I asked myself, and I wonder, did that spill over into support for Mi'kmaq fishers as well, to at least within this region of Mi'kmaq, because people becoming more aware of not just injustice of what's happened to Black people, unarmed Black people when they encountered, you know, the police, but you know, what's been happening to, you know, trans people, what's been happening to Indigenous people, anti-Asian hate that's been going on. And I would say it does seem to be more covered nowadays with it. I'm happy about that. But also what needs to be happening is when we talk about those stories, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, having a Black journalist from the Black community report on that perspective of Black Lives Matter. You know, the same way we would need to see a First Nations voice covering the First Nations issues and sharing that. And as Trina was saying earlier, she interviewed a residential school survivor, and I know her myself too. And there's just going to be that extra level of comfort and familiarity saying, you know, she may ask, Trina, who are you? Where are you from? I'm off Glossop First Nation. She might know a relative or two. She knows a lot of the history of residential schools. So there's no need to build that trust. It's going to already be there because of who Trina is in the first place. That's going to get the story out faster. And it might even cover more accurate. It might capture more of the story too, because there's that extra trust with Trina as a Mi'kmaq journalist. So the former residential school survivor may be comfortable saying, I feel like I can tell her more of what happened.
Can I just hop in because you brought up the fisheries, and that is an exercise. As soon as you look at a story that involves conflict, that illustrates why it's so important to have representation in media, because the Nova Scotia mainstream media is fairly homogenous. You don't have Indigenous reporters in mainstream media in Nova Scotia. And so the use of language and the narrative that, although you're right, Jarvis, there was a lot of support. I was at one of the rallies down in Grand Parade Square, and it was you could see people coming out to support. But the media coverage itself was really problematic, and I've sort of been vocal about that, because the language that's used, and there's this whole thing around like this unbiased media and choosing neutral words, but it tends to other people, right? So if you're from a marginalized community, you tend to get othered. So the unbiased view in journalism or in media tends to be Western and tends to be white, and everybody else then is biased. So in the Migma fisheries, you heard a lot of like, calling it an illegal fishery, like calling it like, always saying like out of season, illegal fishery. And I remember talking to Jolene Marr, who was down there. She's a Migma fisher herself. And she had, from her point of view, she just felt like she wasn't represented, that the Migma perspectives weren't being included in mainstream news, and that it becomes dangerous. That she's put on the wrong side. I think her quote in one of the stories was, "I'm on the wrong side of everything." And so that becomes a danger when the standard is one view, and your perspective as a nation and your rights aren't being represented or understood fully by the reporters that are covering it. It becomes incredibly problematic. So soft stories, sometimes we don't see that. Stories around conflict, we really see where the cracks start to show. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Matthew, we've had many conversations surrounding this before. For instance, over the years in the media, it seems oftentimes stories pertaining to the Black community or other marginalized communities can sometimes get, somewhat swept under the rug or highlighted in a negative way. And so do you think if we had more diversity among the higher ranking positions, that the portrayal and coverage would be different? And could you give me an example of something maybe here locally?
Yeah, well, yeah, you took I won't say the words out of my mouth, but the thought right out of my head as everyone's talking there. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's good to have, Black faces on the screen and stuff like that. I'm, I guess, more concerned about, making sure that the information is accurate in the first place. So, yeah, if you have people behind the scenes, producers, the people that you don't see, it's easy to dissect what you see on the screen, but I think it's even more important, maybe even more important, to have people, behind the scenes making those decisions. Brian once took me on a tour of CBC, so that's the only real insight I have to, what it's like behind the scenes. I don't want to talk like I'm an expert, but I would think that, a lot of those positions, you need experience in the first place, to get into, let's say, a producer's role or a, I don't know, Brian and Trina can name off the different backstage roles or whatever, but, in my NSCC class, yours in my NSCC class, there weren't a lot of Black students. Now, is that the instructor's fault? It's not the instructor's fault. It's not the other white students' fault. But like Brian said, if you don't have people going into this, I guess, profession in the first place, then they're not gaining the skills to become, producers, say 20 years down the road, to say, these are the stories we should be covering, whether it's somebody white covering it, Black or Native. Yeah, and you guys made a lot of good points about, say somebody Native being more receptive to a Native reporter. You see that with stories about women as well. If there's a woman who's, say, the victim of violence, myself as a reporter, I would much rather maybe a woman cover that and feel that she'd probably be more comfortable opening up to her. You see that with stories surrounding race with Black people and things like that. But I don't know. I guess we just sort of, where we grow up like that, that's just sort of the norm. So you don't even think about, what it would be like if it was different. So I don't know if that answers your question. I know I go off on a lot of tangents, but
if I could jump in there on something that you had mentioned in the beginning. So just around leadership, because not only the folks in the back, but also I think leadership is extremely important, because leadership has the ability to set the tone for what is happening in the station or, the company, if we're talking outside of news. And so, I believe, well, I know that the urgency for the majority of the population is never going to meet the urgency for the minority voice, because, my lived experience every day. And so I want change now, but it's not, for white folks, it's not the same, because you're not living, you're not experiencing racism, every day or every other day, or within the newsroom or in the news, or within the company. And so you don't want change as fast as I do. So it's not top of mind. And if you are a white person who is covering issues happening in racialized communities, your perspective might be different from mine or Jarvis or Brian or anybody really, who is from said community. And so I think not only the back room, folks in the back room, but also leadership, I think, is extremely important. And I'll give one example, just that. So in the community I worked in, in Halifax, we recognize, and the young folks recognize, when you look up the name of their community, all was shown was gun violence, or they were shown crime, and these are young folks, junior high. And so what we did intentionally, and it's still running, it's called Spread the Love Day, is we had shirts on that said their community and spread the love, and we went and handed out a lot of just like nice messages to people. And that started to generate positive news media for their community, because the young folks recognized how they were being portrayed within their own community.
Yeah, changing up the narrative for sure. Trina, you told me that someone once asked you, how do you avoid advocacy journalism reporting on Migma issues? So how do you respond to that? What does that reveal about the inquiring individual?
I have had that question, and at first it was very off-putting because I didn't expect it, and I was like, what do they mean? Like, just because I cover, I'm Migma, and I so covering Migma communities, I'm automatically somehow advocating for those communities. Like, we wouldn't say that to like a white reporter covering like, a white event or City Hall, or like a city hall reporter covering City Hall. You're not advocating for the mayor, you're covering, right? And so I just sort of would, at first I would stumble over an answer like, oh, you just like the rigors of journalism, because journalism's journalism. But I've come to, I was at a conference, and Tristan Atone, who used to head the Native American Journalists Association, we were having this conversation, a group of us, because it's not just me that gets that comment. And so his answer, he said his reply now is like, don't be so racist. And I was like, oh, that is a good response, because it really reveals something about the person who's asking you that question. And it's always kind of asked politely. It's never said like how do you avoid? It's just like they genuinely want to know how I don't advocate and how I just report. But it's assuming, it's back to that issue of like bias, and assuming that I must have bias towards the community, towards something, or that I'm not going to somehow report fairly on the community because I'm like from that community. And so that really reveals more about the person asking me that question than it does about me. And really, in thinking about like Indigenous journalism, it's really just journalism, right? And it's journalism about, I tell Indigenous stories, but I it's the same process. We're fair, accurate, right? That's the big one. Bias, I think that's a myth anyway. We all have a social location, and that can help really inform and shape your story in a good way when you have a social location, when you have connections to community, when you have an understanding of how things work and who's who, and the context, right? We can add all that when we're connected to community. So it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't make me an advocate. It makes me connected and in touch with what's happening. So anyway, that I now have a response to that question, but it is problematic, right? That I would be seen as biased, but not someone else in the newsroom.
Meantime, in the newsroom, white journalists are engaging in activism. I've observed it. I've vetoed stories that were so biased that I wouldn't dare let them go through, only to have my higher up, my white higher up, let the activist journalism go through. So the very thing that they don't want people like me or Trina or people who look like us to do, they're reserving that right in some cases for themselves. And some of the journalism is shoddy. So, thank goodness we have now an increase.
Can we get some examples?
You want me to give some examples?
I don't want to step on your toes, Amber. Tell me to shut
boy.
up.
Yeah, no examples right now, but let's just say that the black guy in some cases, this one had to sort of say, wait a minute, that doesn't meet the standard. And it was the whites who said, yes, it does. And they let it go. So all the more reason why, we need to go and go out there and make sure that we are part of the system. This debate endlessly in the Black community about whether we should build from within or without, I guess it'll never go away. I'm firmly of the view that, we cannot abdicate our ownership, our rightful birthright as Canadians of some of these media companies. We own the CBC, for example. We have every right, and we should be flooding into Global and CTV and the Globe and Mail and all the other major media, because if we don't, then around those decision-making tables, decisions we don't like are going to be made. So I'm now, I've had, the more I suppose Black nationalist view in my youth, but now that I'm getting up there, I'm like, no, Black people need to get into journalism school or whatever, whatever means they have to get into these newsrooms. They've got to break the door down, get in there and make sure that they have a seat at the table, because things are happening around that table that affect all of us, but yet not all of us are in there to affect that change from within.
I wanted to answer Trina's question from much, much earlier when she started, and it kind of answers Brian's question as well too, about how to get more people from our community into journalism school so they can ultimately get into the newsroom and share our stories. And as Amber mentioned in my biography, I'm a graduate of Daly Law School, and I'm very proud to say I'm a graduate of the Indigenous Black and Migma initiative, which recruits folks from the Black and Migma community to go into law school so we can enter the legal profession and have our voices and I'll say the word advocacy. I can say that. I'm a lawyer. So, and our perspectives and have our say in, the colonial system that's here. And what has been done with the former director, not the current, I don't know about the current one just because we're under COVID, but pre-COVID times, the former director, Professor Michelle Williams, what she used to do, and I've done this with her a few times, she would go out to Black and Mi'kmaq communities, so not just at the university level, but to high schools in Nova Scotia and Black and Mi'kmaq communities, talk to them about what the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq initiative is, how to get to law school, and how to become a lawyer, and the steps that would take from there. But what the big key she was doing is start young. Don't go to a university career fair. Go to a high school. Go to a high school career fair, maybe even junior high. The younger they are, you put the ideas in their head. Become a journalist. Share your stories, and so hopefully they will stay with that. Taking courses in high school and university that may want to lead them to write, to share, videos and audio or podcasts or whatever, or social media on how to share our stories there. So I don't know if that answers Trina's question or answers Brian's question, but I hate to say it, but I'm using examples like the reverse of Indian residential schools. They try to destroy Indigenous people. How? Through schools, through young children. I want to say, if you want to empower nations and people to share our voices, start them young. Tell them you can be a journalist, you can be a podcaster, or anything like that in the media. But it's not like 5 years out of university. See if you can get into high schools, grade schools, talk to kids now, so it's always on their mind and something that drives them within their heart.
Yeah, very, very strong points there.
I
And
took notes, Travis.
Sorry, Trina, go ahead there.
I just told Jarvis I took notes while he's talking.
Yeah, and Trina, I know that we've actually spoke before too about you told me to try to find a news story or a film where an Indigenous person is talking about regular stuff that doesn't pertain to being Indigenous or Indigenous issues, so to speak. So this was quite eye-opening for me. I hadn't necessarily considered that, but in a lot of instances too, I am African Nova Scotian, and so oftentimes in my newsroom, I'm sent out to cover stories that are pertaining or are of interest to the Black community. So I'm sure this is something that you notice time and time again, and explain that to me.
Yeah, it's this siloing. So there's two things, because diverse newsrooms are important, but don't assume that the Indigenous reporter in your newsroom is only going to tell Indigenous stories, right? They might have an interest in something else, want to cover any kind of, Nova Scotia politics or whatever. But the other thing is, like, I challenge people, and I guess I pay attention to Indigenous stories and Migma stories in particular. So, but I'm sure it might apply. Is like, try and find a story, or even just like a film or like a TV show where there are Indigenous voices that aren't speaking about an Indigenous issue. And I hate the word issue because it makes it seem like it's always just problematic. Like, I don't cover Indigenous issues because that just makes it seem like I'm just covering problems. So I would say I tell Indigenous stories, right? That's different. Semantics maybe, but I think it's an important clarification. But you cannot find, like, Indigenous people are just regular people too, right? Like, they don't, like, it's not all like, and there are really, it's not to take away from those really important stories around, MMIWG, around, high incarceration rates, around like all of those things, those residential school legacy, those are all really important stories. You don't not tell them, but they're not the only stories. And like I've heard here, like, telling the spread the love, right? Telling, like, if you're only encountering those negative images, but if that's the only stories you ever pop up in, like, Indigenous people, they go to regular school, they drive cars, they get dental care, I don't know, like, you name a story, like, just regular thing. Like, they're experts in law. If you're doing a story that you need a legal expert, like there's all kinds of Indigenous people with all kinds of knowledge that could just be in a story that's not about Indigenous issues. And it drives me insane.
Preach.
It even, like, it shapes the way, you look at things. Because even as a Black person, I remember, I think it was Gaynor Watson Cree. She Robert Strang's number 2, I believe.
She was, yeah, she was.
She was doing I think it was a vaccine clinic for SARS back in the day. So I had the TV just sort of on, not paying attention. I see a Black face on the screen. Oh, let me turn it up. What's the Black story they're talking about here? What am I missing? Listening for a few minutes. Wait a minute, this has nothing to do with any sort of Black issue. They just so happen to have a Black person. And here I am, a Black person, assuming that that there must be talking about some sort of racist incident that happened or something like that. I would challenge, if I'm in a position to challenge people, but news reporters, if you're just doing a regular story where you're looking for streeters from people on a new bicycle lane bylaw or something like that, search out some Black people, some Native people. If there's none on Spring Garden Road, well, maybe you want to go to Goddigan Street or somewhere where you're more likely to encounter someone like that. I don't want to snitch on anyone on the panel, but somebody once told me about, they saw, similar to me, they saw a Black man on the screen. Maybe they want to tell a story. They thought they were some sort of sportscaster or something like that.
Yeah, the power of the media, Matt. We're powerful, super powerful. When your whole life you see Black people only in basically 3 types of stories, right? Sports, entertainment, racism, cultural celebrations. For my whole life, that's all I saw, Canada or the States. So when I looked up a year or two ago and saw a dark-skinned brother without the sound on, he was wearing a suit, the first thought in my head was, oh man, that dude's pretty well dressed for a Raptors analyst or whatever. Some thought like that actually went through my head.
In your mind, Black man.
Sound on, huh?
You a Black man?
Yeah,
your mind.
Me. Are you kidding me? I've been living in Canada my whole life. I've been getting inculcated with these stereotypical messages. Eventually it does play in your head, because when I saw the brother up there, because of the last 2,000 times I saw a brother up there, he was talking about the Raptors or something, or race and racism, or cultural celebration. So I assumed that, but then when I unmuted the sound, he was a Toronto trade lawyer, international trade lawyer, talking about the Canada-US softwood lumber deal. which is the most boring story I've ever covered in my career because I've covered it 50 times. I wish it would just die. But you know what happened? I watched the whole dang thing for the first time maybe in my life. I watched the whole segment because a brother was the one talking. And I thought, yes, well, see, now this is the fruits of what we've seen internally in some newsrooms, because I don't want to be 100% negative. There is an increased awareness that the contact lists are dated, that the contact lists are too white, and that the list of people you go to for various expertise on the different issues need to be updated. And there is an increased awareness in some news organizations, and we are also teaching this to our students now, which is that we've been here for a while. Like, I'm seeing Black real estate experts on TV now in Canada, which I never saw before, and that's not new. My aunt was a realtor in the 70s in Markham. It's not like Black people just dropped from the moon. I mean, we've been around since pre-Confederation, as all Nova Scotians know. It's not as well known in central Canada. It's starting to become known. We're starting to become old. I mean, my mom came here in 1957. So most of Canada wasn't even alive.
And I don't mean to beat up on you, Brian, but I guess the point that I, hammered down that, that penetrates our mind is like, think of, if that's how we see it, how, a white person in a position of power, how they see it, with having no connection to Black people, in their lives. It's worse,
and they're the ones doing the hiring. And the CAJ just came out with some bad numbers here about how white Canadian media really is. Finally, we have some numbers to back up what we've known. White journalists hold 81.9% of supervisor roles, 79.6% of top 3 leadership positions, because most newsrooms have essentially 3 powerful people in them, whether you're at a newspaper, a website, a TV, or a radio station. It usually comes in 3s. And disproportionately, the big 3 in the newsroom are white.
I wanted to say that think about how deep-seated this is, that we have to say Indigenous people are regular people too. Like, the fact that we even have to say that, like, it just goes to show like how, and then we have to say like Black folks are not new. Like, it's I'm just sitting here thinking about how deep-seated that this is. And the way that folks are portrayed in the media is not new. I think about Birth of a Nation. I think about minstrel shows. That's a form of media. Think about all of these things, and it seems to be a historical evolution. Not necessarily, it doesn't go away. It looks a little bit different. And then when I think about news station Global, as an example, Chorus Entertainment, owned by J.R. Shaw, and CEO is Doug Murphy. And so, if the organization is headed by 2 white men, I'm not necessarily surprised in terms of representation within the stations, and it's not a surprise for anymore. It's more so like, I'm a little angry, just in terms of because I've heard some of the numbers for Global, just as an example, and across the province there's like under 5, I think, total persons of color within the organization. So I just think the fact that we even have to say, Black folks have been around for a while, Indigenous people are normal people, or are people. It just shows how ingrained that this has been.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I don't know what the format is. This is sort of a story and a question maybe for Brian and Trina, just because you guys are have the positions you have. But Amber, you probably remember. It just so happened to be Global News. They came to talk to our class one day. This was in 2019 in the fall, and they talked, and then they said, "Okay, is there any questions?" Now, Amber, you might remember I raised my hand and I said, "Okay, this Trudeau blackface story just broke. What's going on in that newsroom right now?" They sort of paused for a minute. Oh, is this a trap? But one of the takeaways that I heard from them was that, we look around, we do our best, but where there's no quote unquote diversity or Black people in the media, we have to then, we're a step behind basically. So then fast forward, there's a deadly global pandemic and a Black Lives Matter movement. Brian, I remember there was some some sort of a protest outside of CBC where they were talking about, a lot of the stuff Dorico's talking about in terms of the numbers. So I guess my question is there a silver lining here now where they're like, everyone's looking at us like we don't have enough Black people? Is there a silver lining here now that maybe they are more willing to, take some more Black and Native people on? Or is that wishful thinking?
They're feeling the heat as long as the heat's kept on them. So that protest got attention all the way. The protest you're referring to is August of, boy, my years are getting mixed up. I'm going to say August or September of 2020. There was a protest led by Raymond Shepherd at CBC Nova Scotia. It got right to the top. Right, people all the way in Toronto and Ottawa knew about it. We're having emergency meetings about it. And there were some fairly temporary measures taken. We see that there was briefly an African Nova Scotian video unit that was in effect there. There was a Black on the Prairies unit. Those two units are no longer exist, however. So you got to keep the pressure on any organizations if you want to see those kinds of changes happen. And then because certainly, there are white journalists flooding into every newsroom in Canada every year. Even if the leadership does nothing, that community will continue to flood into the newsrooms. Their issues will continue. Issues that they consider priority will continue to be prioritized in news media. Now, when it comes to issues related to other communities, Indigenous communities, Black communities, that's only going to happen if you have people of color around the table. Here in Nova Scotia, how many stories have we seen on the incredible increase in the number of people from India moving to Halifax, which is clearly a massive demographic shift? I haven't seen a thing on it. Are they afraid? Are they afraid of being called racist if they do it? Do they not like the fact that so many people are coming in from India, even though many of them are coming in as investor class, also from Nigeria? I haven't seen that story covered. I wonder why.
Yeah, very interesting.
I know, can I just add, because I know for Indigenous people, the TRC, the calls to action, sometimes change does come. So I'm a terrible optimist, but it does come, but slowly. And honestly, and one of those is TRC, I don't know, number 86. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But it was really geared towards journalism schools, because you can put the pressure on media organizations, but if journalism schools themselves haven't done the work and we talked about that, I started with that, about getting Indigenous or just diverse student body, then you're not going to see a diverse professional, journalism field, right? And so you have to start. And so the universities in general, you're starting to see a push now for recruitment, but I mean that's when was the TRC, Jarvis? 2015? I'm terrible with dates.
It came out December 2015.
2015. So that's, do you know what I mean? That's a long delay. And then by the time you actually do the work and see it, so the payoff is going to be down the road, right? It's not going to happen next year. And then the payoff in terms of seeing those people filter through to management is even further down the road. I know that APTN sometimes we bleed a lot of people over to CBC, and one of our news directors, Karen Pugliese, would always say, who herself now works for CBC, would always say that that's okay. Like if APTN sort of loses people, if they've learned what they learned here, and then they go and they end up in mainstream, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? And so, we do have APTN, for our stories and for storytelling. But anyways, there's a lot of work to do. I'm realizing that it happens very slowly.
Yeah, Matthew, I wanted to ask you, do you think that the way certain individuals or groups are portrayed in the media, depicts sort of like a false reality, or the sense that, maybe we're living in a bubble?
Short answer, yes. I think we alluded to some of that earlier. Like, if we're talking about not just news media, one of the things I'll say is you're either, Barack Obama or Omar from The Wire, whereas there's so much Black middle class that really I think makes up the majority of I guess, Black North Americans in the first place. You'll see that covered, I guess, from time to time, but you don't see that like a whole lot. In short, I don't know if there was anything like more specific that you meant. I mean, it's easy, like, people say like, oh, the news media is racist. They want to depict us like this and that. And that is true, but it becomes, I don't know, we get to talking too much rhetoric sometimes where we just gravitate to that. Like I'm a madman. I tape all the news, all the news broadcasts every day, as you know, and I'll sit there and watch them. So I do pick out the little things like, oh, well, they got that part wrong. They didn't get that part wrong. I mean, around here locally, I think they get it right more often than I guess some people sometimes believe they do. I don't know. It's hard to say. It comes down to like, why are you talking to this person in the first place? There's a whole Black faculty like at Dalhousie where, they study issues of race that they could be talking on it versus, just somebody that you saw on the steps, somebody that, like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but it depends on where you look. I think that here in Nova Scotia, even Black people, we sometimes look at the way Black people are portrayed, in the media and sort of associate that with our reality, when in reality, we have it, we're not riddled with gun violence the way they say they are in Detroit or something like that. But even Black people sometimes will buy into, we need to be a certain way. And when you look at the forest for the trees, I think media has a lot to do with that. Even Black media, you look at like, World Star, hip hop and things like that. But, I think there's good people out there doing stuff. It's just a matter of, who's cutting the check to say, okay, well, this person's the one who gets airtime or who doesn't. I don't know. It's hard to say. It depends on the day of the week.
Yeah,
There
does
are
anybody
tropes.
weigh in on that, Trina?
Yeah, there are tropes. I know for like sometimes there's the Indigenous victim, and then like the white expert. There's that trope, or there's like the powwow dancer. You want to do like positive story, and I find most stories are so layered, and people even in what you would call like a negative story, there's still like agency and resiliency. So there's like a way to like just sort of break out of those like images that we sometimes create, like of these like sort of almost like stereotypical images, of people. And so, or when we're surprised, ooh, an Indigenous doctor. That's a story. It's like, oh, it's like a surprise story. It's like, why is that a surprise? Like, I don't know. So yeah, I find there are, sometimes like just not the caricatures, but sometimes we just have like, there's the warrior, there's the powwow dancer. And I mean, people are much more layered than that. And even when they are the victim, even when it's that kind of serious story, and maybe, sometimes there is gun violence or there is conflict, there's still, or there is trauma. Like I said before, you don't not do that story, but you pay attention to that there's probably Indigenous experts or Black experts that you can, go to, that there's resiliency and agency even within people who are suffering trauma and moving forward. So it's not just like, sort of, there's the nuances, I guess, which sometimes don't get captured in quick media stories and media bites and images and stuff like that.
Nuances.
Also, like, if you are, say, reporting on, say, a Black person or a Native person in negative light, let's say they've committed a crime, I think a lot of times, at least around here, our mind goes to, we know how a racist white person is going to react to that story. And so we say, oh, the medias are racist for covering it in the first place. Like, well, no, they're going to cover, a shooting in a Black neighborhood the way they're going to cover the white boys shooting up in Spryfield or something like that. It's just that, we hone in on those stories because we know that somebody say we know is going to be involved in the story or something like that. And automatically our mind goes to, oh, we know what the racist people are going to react. And so I think we just need to separate that from, the fact that news media has to cover that anyways. Now we can then break down, did they cover it accurately? Did they use the right terms like Trina was saying? But it's more nuanced than just, oh, the media's out to get us or they're not, I think.
Also, there's a lack of understanding of the humanity sometimes in the Black community. For example, when our communities are shot up, we're pissed. When our communities are shot up, we feel unsafe. We want more safety and security in our communities. That nuance isn't covered. The fact that people in the Black community want justice and security within their communities. This caricature of the, sort of the, on the one hand, criminality within our community, and then on the other hand, people collaborating with the criminals or refusing to help out law enforcement to catch those people. Ridiculous. In any community that is not feeling safe, they want safety and they want security. However, I think maybe we've got a divide between some of our institutions and how they're perceived and how they cover. So the media now have had generations of objectifying and also stereotyping the Black community. So that trust is broken. So rebuilding the trust is a priority, should be a priority. It's going to be difficult if some of the other issues we've been talking about for almost an hour aren't resolved.
There's one thing or a couple things I wanted to add to the conversation here in regards to when I think about caricatures or how folks are portrayed. There's the athlete, there's the advocate / activist, there's the violent criminal, and then there's the resilient person who has made it out of their community and transcended these circumstances. And for me, when I think about media coverage, I'm hesitant to make a blanket statement, but generally that's sort of how I see, at least, the young Black men or Black men portrayed in the media. And I've never called myself an activist. The media said activist, and when I see other Black folks in community, that's how they were labeled, because they're speaking out against something an injustice that may have happened in their community. But those sort of four things: the resilient person, the violent criminal, the advocate / activist, and then the athlete. But the regular everyday stories, and even to Brian's point, is that when acts of violence do happen within Black communities, Black folks want justice, but then there's also this really beautiful collaborative thing that happens where people are all coming together and trying to figure out the issues within, and a lot of it actually does get sorted out. A lot of new initiatives happen, and a lot of great things come to the community and come out of folks getting together. And people are healing their own trauma within their community and making a way where there isn't. And that part just isn't really covered. With all of the tragedies that happen, the community comes together itself, but the media will cover the violence or whatever it was that happened, but forget about the other beautiful pieces that always happen out of that.
Does anybody else want to add to that, Jarvis?
I do want to add a bit to what Brian and Trina were saying earlier, and I think Dorico alluded to this earlier in the conversation about just media representation. And I remember when I was talking to my friend Michelle Williams at the law school, and we were talking about movies, and this would have been 2009, 2010, so about 8 years before Black Panther came out. And we were talking about Indigenous Native characters you would see. And virtually, I think the stereotype I remember about movies was, and my cousin is an actor, and he once posted an event about this, was we're either depicted as dead, drunk, or in jail, or something along those lines there. And I said at the time, I told Michelle that, because I think I just saw the Star Trek movie, one of those newer ones. It was really cool. And I said, I would like to see one day, who I forgot the captain's name in Star Trek. Not Jean-Luc Picard, the one before. Captain Kirk, thank you. I want to see one day Captain Kirk, or the leader of like the starring role of like a big sci-fi multi-million-dollar budgeted film, played by an Indigenous actor, very visibly Indigenous. But for whatever reason, I say, you know what? I don't want the movie to be about Indigenous issues. I want this movie to be about, like, you know, space aliens invading Earth, which theoretically is kind of like what happened here. But, you know,
Jarvis,
yeah,
Boba Fett is Indigenous.
he's Maori, I think.
That's right.
Yes, we're enjoying Boba Fett, actually. But thank you for that. And if you're watching the Book of Boba Fett, to my knowledge so far, like, the actor who plays him is Maori. The movie has nothing to do about him being Indigenous. He's a bounty hunter. And at the same time, it's like, you know, Star Wars, Star Trek, leadership of some sorts. I kind of don't want to see it about being Indigenous issues. I don't know, bounty hunting or being a rebel against the Empire, something along those lines. But I still want to see myself. And I just don't want to see myself as a side character in the background. I want to see myself leading the ship, taking leadership. And yes, they're Migma, they're Indigenous. If my cousin Glenn Gould ends up ever doing that, I would love that. But part of me says, I'm happy we have movies that deal with Indigenous issues. Lots of movies about residential schools. Lots of movies about contact colonialism and that genocide. But at the same time, I do still want to see myself on that big screen, you know, spaceships or whatever, and not being about it being about Indigenous issues. I just want it to be about something else. I want to see that, you know, as was Trina saying, being normalized, being a normal thing, being a normal spaceship captain.
Graham Greene in Die Hard. He is a side character, but the fact that he's Indigenous doesn't come up.
I have never seen any Die Hard movie, and I did not know Graham Greene was in that.
Yeah, he's in one of them. It's not the first one, but I watch it.
Thank you. I'm looking for that now. Just for him. Just for him.
Now, just really quickly, I know that we just spoke to how, Trina, you know, how with Indigenous issues, you're saying, like, Indigenous people can speak about anything. But I want to kind of change the script here and talk, for instance, you know, the murder of George Floyd. And then, you know, every news station in North America for sure would say, run out to the Black communities and say, talk to the Black people about how they're feeling about this. But really, this is not a Black issue, right? This is an issue of colonialism. So how do we stop running to the Black people to talk about violence in their areas, or go to a residential school survivor when they're discovering a new mass grave? How do we change this?
I just want to put the question out there, is that throughout the entire George Floyd incidents, did we interview any police officers? I mean, like, and because when we're talking about that issue specifically, and it not being a Black issue, and it being centered around police brutality, did we interview any police officers? Did we have a news story on the, you know, on just with an officer speaking about it? And so it's, you know, I think that it's a the word's not slippery slope, but when things happen in the Black community, and then running to the Black community, if you're only there when that stuff is happening, I think that is also a part of the difference, because communities I've worked in said, we never see the news station when we're, you know, having a community celebration. We never see them when we're helping each other out. But when something bad happens, they're coming to us to get the provocative story. And so, you know, I have some things to add, and maybe we'll get to that towards the end in terms of some things that might be helpful solutions.
I like, yeah, it's true. It's that idea of almost like that parachute journalism, but we only jump in when something's gone wrong or something's bad, right? And then you hop back out and you don't see the good stuff that happens. It's one of those things where you don't ignore a story. Like I've literally read a story like about Migma people without Migma voices, and I'm like, what? You can't talk about the Migma fisheries without interviewing someone who's Migma to talk about the treaty right, or to counter, right? You can't do that. Or they, you know, occupy that little spot at the bottom of the story. So you can't have that. But just say racism. Like if racism is something that impacts people of color, but it's not actually their problem to fix, right? So that's a story that you don't just go to the reaction. How did it feel when someone was racist? You should be going to the people in power and holding people accountable. So that's it's not it that's a Canadian issue that impacts people of color. And so if you're only telling it as a story and interviewing you know, I don't know, people who are on the other side of like police brutality, but you're not interviewing police officers. Like it's
I
that
would have
like
loved
the full story.
I would have loved to see real reporting on the Wortley report. I read the whole thing. One of the most important reads of my life because I got insight into how my country works. How many of the Black men who were in that statistic, right? The statistic that's oft reported about being 6 times more likely to be street checked than whites. When you see how many of those Black men had white girlfriends and wives who were traumatized because they were in the car during the police stop, do they not count? They're white. Do they not count? If the reporting had been more nuanced and if the journalists had gone deeper into that report, maybe somebody would have understood that when you hurt one of us, you hurt other people too. Because I don't think that I can't, you know, I'll never be white, thank God. I love being me, but I don't think they really care that much because they don't really think that when something affects somebody in their community, in their province and in their country, regardless of what color it is, that it affects them.
And even like white people, like, you know, say who aren't racist, how often are you in a situation, like say with a bunch of Black people and a white person walks in, or there's just that assumption that they think I'm racist. So you put a story like George Floyd out there, then, you know, that sort of just gets heightened and there's even more division.
I just wanted to say in regards to the Wortley report, I've read that a couple of times, and you know, I agree. Just sort of like, yeah, I don't think that was accurately covered. I don't think that uh, critically thought about in terms of the coverage. Really surface level. Black folks are 6 times more likely to be stopped by police. Headline, a little bit about the conference, and then that's sort of the end of it. But if you read it, there's officers and folks in there admitting to all kinds of things, but none of that is covered. I've yet to see, and maybe they just won't, and maybe they're not asked, but officers commenting on that particular report, or just in general.
Why not though? They're in there. They're quoted. Some of them are saying, "Yeah, I know my partner's racist. Yeah, I know this is white officers. Yeah, I know. I'm surrounded. I hear what they say about Black people, and it disgusts me. But those are the same guys who have to back me up if I go into a dark alley or go into a dangerous situation. So I don't speak out with my name." That was in the report. That needs to be reported.
Amber, you still with us? You dipped out for a minute.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a me issue. I apologize. Yeah, so in closing, I kind of want to talk to the veterans here of media who've been in this game for quite some time. From your first days working in the industry and where we are now, how much progress has actually been made? Brian, we'll start with you, and then Trina will end with you here if you don't mind.
Mixed progress. Actually, the percentage of Black journalists in Canada has declined since I entered the media in the mid 90s. Incredible, since our numbers have skyrocketed. And that just has to do with, you know, look, we're not as into journalism as a career as the whites are. I know that from having worked for 25 years and seeing them come in all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed out of journalism school, just flooding in. And many of them, their parents already work in the newsroom or work in the industry. So there are cultural things there. So has there progress? I think the numbers are not very inspiring. However, attitudes are changing. I know some white crime reporters They can see that the coverage of blacks in crime reporting has been two-dimensional, and the coverage of whites has been three-dimensional. You know, and the coverage of white victims is 360-degree coverage, where you really see a picture, a portrait of the person who was killed or raped or whatever the case may be. Whereas coverage of Black and Indigenous victims is pretty much perfunctory. They recognize that. So my optimism lies partly in the fact that over time, the facts are seeping in maybe to the minds and hearts of some of my former colleagues, and they're understanding that they need to do better. And interestingly enough, if news media would only follow their own ethical guidelines, the ones that Trina and I teach every day, that would cause a great change, a great positive change. It would cover over a multitude of sins. But the problem is that they've fallen short of the mark in the media, following their own guidelines. And that's why we have a lot of the problems we're talking about today.
Yeah, I'll just add that I know for like when I first started with APTN, I was wandering around reserves in Migma with the camera all by myself, covering stories that nobody else was covering, like mainstream was not there. You see, it's a vast difference. If we just look at the stories that are covered now about Indigenous communities and people, there's an improvement. Is it always perfect? It is not. But is that the media doing a better job? I actually will give the credit to Indigenous peoples, like which really started to change with Idle No More. And you saw Indigenous people sort of forcing their story and putting it out there. And you see that again and again, that Indigenous peoples, you know, through activism and taking on sort of that education so that people understand the relevant stories that they want covered and putting it out there. It's because of Idle No More and other initiatives like that that you see more coverage, the media responding to that. So it is covered more. It's up and down in terms of whether it's better. But I still think there's a long way to go in terms of getting Indigenous people in front of the camera or behind the camera, operating the camera. There's a lot of work to do there for sure.
So that concludes our time for this evening. I look forward to having more discussions with you all like this again in the future. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your time.
Halalio. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well,
Thank you, Amber.